Today is March 3rd, 2023. I want to talk about growing tensions between the United States and China, and specifically regarding Taiwan. I think that it's very important to keep an eye on both this and the U.S. proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. They are directly linked, and both of these are going to be pivotal epicenters of geopolitics. They were last year, they will continue to be this year. And so as the US is slowly burning Ukraine to the ground with its proxy war with Russia, they are busy trying to get another proxy war going with China. And they're doing it not with one country nearby China against China. They're actually doing it within Chinese territory. They are doing it by involving the Chinese province and island province of Taiwan. And it's not me calling it a Chinese province. It's not even just Beijing calling it a Chinese province. It is actually the United Nations that calls it a Chinese province. And this is something that I have heard said over and over again, but believe it or not, I only just checked it now. I actually looked at the United Nations decision, which settled the status of Taiwan decades and decades ago, and it's only because of the immense and unwarranted power and influence of the United States that this myth that Taiwan is somehow some sort of separate entity, an autonomous or independent entity separate from the rest of China, that is the only reason why it remains somehow a question, is because the United States insists on making it a question, even though the UN settled it a long time ago. And some people might want to argue with me and say, well, Brian, Taiwan is obviously an autonomous entity. There's no denying that. Well, I would argue that without US interference and both political and military support, Taiwan would not exist in the way that it does today. It would have been reunified with the rest of China, I would say decades ago, shortly after the Chinese Civil War ended. Now, notice how I left out economic support. I said military and political support. I did not mention economic support. This is something that needs to be pointed out every single time we talk about Taiwan. The fact that the economy on this island of Taiwan is already well on its way to being completely reunified with the rest of China. And I pointed this out many times before. This is the Harvard University Atlas of Economic Complexity, and they're talking about exports from the island of Taiwan. And you can see between mainland China and Hong Kong, which is also part of China, it constitutes about half of their exports go to the rest of China. And as you can see, Asia by far makes up the vast majority of where Taiwan exports its goods to. Notice the United States, and Germany, United Kingdom, all of Europe, and everywhere else combined is less than just mainland China itself. And if you look at these polls that say the Pew Research Center conducts, where they claim people on Taiwan would like to have closer economic relations with the United States instead of with China, it just goes to show you how U.S. interference in Taiwan, in their information space, in their educational system, the money the U.S. pours into Taiwan to interfere there, just like they did since 1991 in Ukraine, how it has warped the minds of the people living there, and their opinion is so far detached from actual reality and their actual best interests. And this is why it is dangerous to simply say, well, let Taiwan decide for themselves. Well, how can they decide for themselves when its information space, political system, and educational system is completely dominated by the US and its proxies? And the answer is it cannot. Let's go back to this and look at imports. Even for imports, its largest import source is from the rest of China. And a lot of the imports from the rest of China to Taiwan are inputs, crucial inputs for Taiwan's semiconductor and electrical component industry, which is its largest and most important industry. So right there, the economic reality is that Taiwan is clearly part of China. The US is artificially trying to pry it away from China with these myths of being autonomous, self-governed, when in reality, politically and militarily, it is entirely dependent on the US. There's no independence or sovereignty of any kind involved, and the government itself makes no decisions without it interlocking with the US agenda for Taiwan. Now, before I get into what's actually going on with Taiwan right now in the headlines this week, I want to talk about UN Resolution 2758. And this is something that I had heard about and I've heard referenced, but again, believe it or not, I didn't look at it. When you actually look at it, it is so damning and it is so revealing in terms of how badly the US has stepped in, interfered in China's internal political affairs, and how blatantly the US is trampling the very international law it claims it's trying to uphold against what it calls Chinese aggression and also Russian aggression. Let's take a look. This is it from the UN official website, UN.org, United Nations Digital Library. It's titled Restoration of the Lawful Rights of the People's Republic of China in the United Nations. And it looks something like this. And I'm going to read from this resolution. It says, recalling the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, considering that the restoration of the lawful rights of the People's Republic of China is essential both for the protection of the Charter of the United Nations and for the cause the United Nations must serve under the Charter, recognizing that the representatives of the government of the People's Republic of China are the only lawful representatives of China to the United Nations, and that the People's Republic of China is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, decides to restore all its rights to the People's Republic of China and to recognize the representatives of its government as the only legitimate representatives of China to the United Nations, and to expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place which they unlawfully occupy at the United Nations and in the organizations related to it. And this resolution was dated October 25th, 1971. And so the issue was, on Taiwan is a government called the Republic of China. On mainland China, in Beijing, is a government called the People's Republic of China. And before this resolution was passed, it was the Republic of China on Taiwan in Taipei that was the representative of China. And this was rectified all the way in the early 70s. And only because the US, its immense unwarranted power and influence, has this issue been kept open and the Taiwan question left hanging, artificially left unanswered, maybe you could say. And then people will say, well, Brian, that's 1970, come on. But we could look at things more recent like this. Final clauses of multilateral treaties, handbook, again, official UN website, UN.org. And if you look through, you will see this right here. And it says, regarding the Taiwan province of China, right there, the Taiwan province of China. Taiwan is a province of China. That is what they're saying. The Secretary General follows the General Assembly's guidance incorporated in Resolution 2758, which I was just reading from, of the General Assembly of 25 October 1971 on the resolution of the lawful rights of the People's Republic of China and the United Nations. The General Assembly decided to recognize the representatives of the government of the People's Republic of China as the only legitimate representatives of China to the United Nations. Hence, instruments received from the Taiwan province of China, there it is again, will not be accepted by the Secretary General in his capacity as depositary. And you can see very clearly that the UN's position on Taiwan is unambiguous. It is a province of China. There's only one government in China, that is the People's Republic of China in Beijing. The Republic of China is an illegitimate government pretending to be the sole legitimate government of all of China, and I would say illegally exercising authority over Taiwan, and doing so only because the United States, a nuclear-armed superpower, is backing them militarily and politically. And if that backing was cut or diminished or undercut by other factors, which is exactly what's going on right now, then Taiwan would cease to exist as this U.S. proxy inside Chinese territory, and reunification, peaceful, mutually beneficial reunification, would take place. This is the problem. And because China is rising and the U.S. is fading, the U.S. realizes they have a very small window of opportunity to use Taiwan as a pretext and as leverage in a conflict with China in a last-ditch attempt to prevent China from surpassing the United States. I've talked about this many times, that even the United States, and again, this is something that has to be pointed out every single time, because I guarantee you, if you polled Americans right now in the United States and you ask them, is Taiwan a country? I guarantee you the vast majority of them would say, yes, it is a country. But this is what it actually says on the U.S. Department of State's official website, state.gov, U.S. relations with Taiwan. The links to all of this will be in the video description below, so you can check and see for yourself. This is what it says. It says the United States has a long-standing one China policy, which is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, which is irrelevant because that is just an internal U.S. law that they passed, has no impact or authority or jurisdiction over Taiwan or any other part of China. But also the 3 U.S.-China joint communiques and the 6 assurances, which were actually agreements the United States made with the People's Republic of China in Beijing. It also says we do not support Taiwan independence. So they're saying we uphold the one China policy, which means there's only one China. Taiwan is part of it. There's only one legitimate government over all of China. That is the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And they also explicitly say we do not support Taiwan independence. And yet everything that they do as a matter of policy regarding Taiwan undermines their own agreement they made with Beijing, and is also in contravention of international law, and more specifically the UN Charter, as I just read to you, and as the UN itself mentions. The US, by arming essentially separatists on Taiwan in this Chinese province of Taiwan, by U.S. representatives traveling to the island province of Taiwan and meeting with separatist politicians, political leaders, without Beijing's approval. All of this is blatant violations of international law, of the United Nations Charter that the U.S. itself pretends it is the leading nation upholding around the globe. The entire issue surrounding Taiwan is whole cloth created by the United States. It's not a two-way road here. Again, what we see on the island of Taiwan, if you follow the money in the media space, information space, in their local political system, it is all influenced by huge amounts of U.S. government money, just like they admittedly did in Ukraine from 1991 onward, pouring billions of dollars into Ukraine to shape its information, political, socio-political space. They have done the exact same thing on the island province of Taiwan. The idea that Taiwan should be independent or autonomous or any of the things that we hear coming out of the current administration in Taipei, headed by the Democratic Progressive Party and Tsai Ing-wen, who's the current president of Taiwan, everything that they are saying stems from Washington's vision for Taiwan, not the actual vision of Taiwan involving the people living there and referring to their own best interests. Obviously, their own best interests are not served by separating Taiwan from the rest of China. As you see, their economy is completely dependent on the rest of China. That would be a disaster. It would be as disastrous or more so than when Ukraine had a new client regime installed into power in 2014, and they irrationally cut all of their ties with Russia, and it's completely destroyed their economy, and their economy has been going downhill ever since, even before the special military operation began last year in late February. So what's going on in Taiwan? With all of that in mind, what's going on in Taiwan right now? What is in the headlines this week? This is from Reuters. Taiwan military to get $619 million U.S. arms boost as China keeps up pressure. How is China keeping up pressure. Pressure on what if Taiwan is admittedly, according to the UN, just another province of China? What is China keeping pressure up on? Obviously, pressure on Washington regarding its interference in China's internal political affairs. This is what the article says. The United States has approved the potential sale of $619 million in new weapons to Taiwan, including missiles for its F-16 fleet, as the island reported a second day of large-scale Chinese Air Force incursions nearby. I'll get into these incursions in just a moment. Again, how is China carrying out any sort of incursion if Taiwan is recognized internationally as its own territory? Think about that. And think about how the Western media reports this in concert, and for decades they have portrayed China acting within its own borders as some sort of external conflict, as some sort of act of aggression against an outside nation, another nation. Reuters continues, it says, the Pentagon said on Wednesday the U.S. State Department has approved the potential sale to Taiwan of arms and equipment that includes 200 anti-aircraft advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles, AMRAAM, and 100 AGM-88B HARM missiles that can take out land-based radar stations. Well, they might be able to take out land-based radar stations, but as we see in Ukraine, when they are up against a formidable integrated air defense system, that is very hard to do, and I can't imagine it'll be any easier for these separatist forces on Taiwan if there is ever a conflict between them and the rest of China. Reuters goes on and says the proposed sale will contribute to the recipient's capability to provide for the defense of its airspace, regional security, and interoperability with the United States, it said in a statement. So think about what they're saying, what the United States is saying. We just read from the United Nations, Taiwan is a province of China. Even the U.S. State Department's official website admits that Taiwan is not independent. It obviously, through the process of elimination, if it is not independent, it is dependent on someone. It is dependent on the rest of China. So by sending weapons to part of China without China's approval, and specifically to encourage separatism and a potential conflict between this rogue province and the rest of China, you can see how this is clearly the very source of U.S.-Chinese tensions over Taiwan. And you can see how it is the U.S. clearly and solely responsible for this. But I want to point out how what they're saying, the U.S. is saying this will contribute to the recipient's capability to provide for the defense of its airspace, which it doesn't have because it's not a country. So it doesn't have airspace to protect under international law. And it also says regional security and interoperability with the United States. And that last part is admitting that what the U.S. is doing is they are creating a military force within Chinese territory that is acting on behalf of the United States. And this is why they need this interoperability. But these missiles are not going to help these forces on Taiwan. I want to point out a paper that I've already talked about in previous videos. It is by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. This is a US government and Western arms industry funded think tank. CSIS, and this was their recent report, The First Battle of the Next War, Wargaming a Chinese Invasion of Taiwan. They have a landing site right here. I'll put the link to this in the video description below, and there is this paper, 165 pages, and it says right down here, move Taiwanese air and naval forces toward asymmetry. Despite rhetoric about adopting a porcupine strategy, Taiwan still spends most of its defense budget on expensive ships and aircraft that China will quickly destroy. What they're admitting is, and just look at what happened when Russia began its special military operation last year, it's admitting that China will very quickly, in the opening days and weeks of any potential conflict, they will completely destroy all of these warplanes and the entire navy of the administration on Taiwan right now. It will not be a factor in any sort of protracted conflict between Taiwan and the rest of China. So what is this actually then? Besides taking U.S. taxpayer money and also the taxpayers on the island province of Taiwan, taking that money and transferring it to the U.S. arms industry, it is a provocation, a military and political provocation. It is also the reinforcing of this narrative that the U.S. has kept alive, despite the UN solving the Taiwan question, answering the Taiwan question all the way back in the 70s. This is part of the U.S. overriding it. This might makes right that the U.S. claims it's standing up against, regarding Russia and Ukraine. This is the U.S. actually using might makes right to override the UN's final decision on Taiwan. They're constantly pouring money and weapons into Taiwan, and they're proving that it doesn't matter what the official status is of Taiwan. We're making it this separate entity with its own army and its own government. They're trying to normalize their trampling of Chinese sovereignty and, by extension, the trampling of international law. That is what they're doing. And I have to constantly point these things out because the entirety of the Western media never reports any of these facts that you can see come straight from the UN, the UN's official website, the US State Department's official website. These are all documented, irrefutable facts that the Western media never ever mentions in their coverage of Taiwan. And I regret to say that even people who follow my coverage of the conflict in Ukraine will see me talking about China and US interference in Taiwan, and they will say, "You've got that all wrong." And then they will, the next thing they will do is begin reciting claims almost verbatim from the US State Department regarding Taiwan's supposed status, after already agreeing with me that the US State Department is lying in every way about Ukraine and Russia. Something else we're going to see a lot in headlines are articles like this. Every time the US starts ratcheting up its meddling in Taiwan, we see articles like this. It's actually from Reuters via CNBC. Taiwan reports second day of large Chinese incursion into its air defense zone. So not its airspace, it's air defense zone. And we've already sorted out the fact that Taiwan doesn't even have any airspace or territory for China to carry out some sort of incursion into, because Taiwan is part of China. And what they're actually talking about is the Air Defense Identification Zone, ADIZ. This has no basis in international law, is entirely unilateral, arbitrary, and it is something that nations usually will agree to recognize if they're reasonable, but there is no obligation at all to recognize and respect an ADIZ set up by a nation. And when China set up their own ADIZs, the US made a point of violating them, and China is flying through the ADIZ of the administration on Taiwan specifically to assert its sovereignty over this island province of Taiwan. They're doing the same thing the US is doing, only China has a legitimate justification for doing so. The United States does not. The article even says the Chinese aircraft have been flying in Taiwan's ADIZ, not its territorial airspace, which they don't have because they're not a country. The ADIZ is a broader area Taiwan monitors and patrols that gives it more time to respond to any threats. And this is via Wikipedia, and you can see the different ADIZs in the region: Japan's, Korea, South Korea, China's ADIZ, which is actually much more modest than, say, Japan's or even South Korea's. And then you can see the administration on the island province of Taiwan. You can see the ADIZ they set up, which actually overlaps a large section of mainland China. It is utterly absurd. And when you look at the maps that the the Taiwan administration puts up when they show the incursions. Chinese warplanes are usually going over the very, very edges of these ADIZs. Even though China is fully justified to even just completely fly over the island province of Taiwan, they don't, because they don't want to escalate. They don't want to provoke a conflict. They want peaceful, mutually beneficial reunification. But on the other hand, they do absolutely have to assert their sovereignty over this island province, because the United States is trying to undermine it, strip it away. So China has to assert its sovereignty over the island, but they want to do it in the least provocative way, which shows you who is the mature player here in this growing potential conflict. But every time tensions between the US and China begin to rise over Taiwan, we see the Western media bring this up to make it as if China is bullying this poor independent country of Taiwan by flying into their airspace, when it is an ADIZ, and when in reality, according to the UN international law, the US claims it's trying to uphold and stand up against China's transgressions against it. It's actually well within China's rights to fly anywhere it wants near or over Taiwan. Of all of the wars of aggression, proxy wars, and attempts to subvert another nation's sovereignty, this project of the United States is regarding Taiwan is probably the most absurd. It is being done on the most flimsy of pretexts. But that is because the US is doing this out of desperation. The rise of China and it surpassing not just the United States, but the collective West. This is something the US is desperate to stop. They have no real good options to do so. And they understand that between 2025 and 2030, the window of opportunity to fight and potentially win a military conflict with China, that window of opportunity is going to close forever. And from 2030 onward, any military conflict the US wages against China is going to result in a decisive defeat of the United States, and it will only compound America's fading from the global stage. If a conflict begins between the United States and China over Taiwan, now you know why. This is something to keep a very close eye on. I said that it's linked directly to the US proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, because this is all about, in general, both Russia and China, not just Russia or China. The US wants to eliminate both Russia and China, and they want to do it by waging these proxy conflicts, justifying economic sanctions and military actions to undermine, divide, and destroy both Russia and China. That is what we are watching, and we are watching Russia and China respond to these provocations. So again, we have to keep a very close eye on growing US tensions with China, as well as the US proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. These are two pivotal conflicts that are going to determine the future of the entire planet in terms of whether or not the US-led unipolar order endures or if multipolarism displaces it. So if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps my channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. I've also listed all of the links to everything that I've referenced in this video. There's also ways in the video description below where you can help support my work. I don't monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it. It's not doing me any good. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. And to everyone who has been helping, whether it's one-time donations, people who donate month to month, or even if you're just helping share my work with others, I greatly appreciate all of that. That is what makes this work possible. It's what makes this work effective, especially the part where people are sharing this information that is critical, and I greatly appreciate that. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.